up, everybody out there? Welcome to the Backmarkers F1 Show podcast. This is episode number 137. Thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. I am your host, Chris Cato, and we've got a full house in store for today's show, a really big show planned today, and a really important one as well, not just because of the excitement that we had at the British Grand Prix in this past weekend, but some really big breaking news that just happened in the past 24 hours. And I couldn't be happier to be joined by my fellow backmarkers to get their instant reaction and to get all of the debate and topics out in front of you guys here on YouTube and on the podcast world. So without further ado, let's bring them in now. Shaker Barty, Tyler McDonald, how you guys doing today?
Doing great. Great to see you boys, and yeah, lots of F1 drama coming around over the last few weeks, and especially the last 24 hours. So excited to see what you boys think about the recent developments.
Yeah, a lot of exciting news, and it's kind of like a little start to, summer silly season, which is kind of nice. So it's like a nice little head start for us to see what it's going to come out in the next 3 weeks or so. So pretty excited.
I kind of forgot about silly season now that you mention it, but we were going to start this podcast initially, obviously talking about the British Grand Prix because it was interesting and there was some things that we will get to, but we do have to talk about the big news of the last 24 hours. And if you guys have been living under a rock, or maybe you're in some different time zone and you haven't been able to hear the news, you're going to maybe hear it here first on the Backmarkers F1 Show podcast, and that is that Nyck de Vries is out at AlphaTauri, and he is being replaced by quite the familiar driver that we all know, Mr. Daniel Ricciardo. The former Red Bull driver is now moving to AlphaTauri for the remainder of the 2023 season and is on loan from Red Bull. And this is quite the surprising move. I know that we've talked a lot about Daniel Ricciardo in last season and in the preseason as well in terms of his future in F1. But this move comes as a bit of a surprise to everybody in the F1 world for many different reasons. So this topic is going to take up the first half of this podcast because it's so interesting and there's a lot of different ways that we can go to it. But first, let's just get initial reactions from the three of us. Tyler, I'll start with you. This is still a couple of hours fresh for us here. What's your initial reaction to Daniel Ricciardo's promotion and Nyck de Vries' demotion out of Formula One?
I mean, I'm very happy for Danny Rick. I mean, I think he still should be in Formula One. But in my opinion, I mean, obviously we're not on the inside of Red Bull, but I just feel bad for Nyck de Vries because, that's, with the 10 races that he got with AlphaTauri to prove himself, that's not a lot of time in Formula One to prove yourself. And I know he had a tough start, but I mean, if every driver had a tough start and got sacked after 10 races, we wouldn't see a lot of drivers that we still see on the grid on there. I mean, Yuki Tsunoda had a really tough start to his career. So did Guan Yu Zhu, in my opinion. And I think he was pretty hard done by here. He's a very talented driver. I mean, he's won a Formula E championship. He won a Formula 2 championship. This isn't some sort of pay to sponsor driver that has come up just so you can get some funds. This is a very talented driver. So I feel pretty bad for Nyck.
So yeah, just very unfortunate for Nyck de Vries in the end, and I hope he ends up finding a drive maybe in some other, either in IndyCar and whatever he decides to go for, if he decides to go back to Formula E. And very happy for Danny Rick at the same time. Very stoked to see him back on the grid. But it is the AlphaTauri spot is usually like a young driver spot. So it's kind of weird to see Danny Rick in it in the first place. But again, just very excited to see Danny Rick back on the grid in general. So it'll be good.
This came as quite out of left field. But I will say that in this case, it isn't so surprising because also remember that Nyck de Vries is not a Red Bull driver. He's not a Red Bull Academy driver. He's actually from the Mercedes program, and this was kind of one of the first instances where Red Bull's junior team would go outside of the Red Bull family and hire a driver. And AlphaTauri was in a very difficult spot last year because they let Pierre Gasly go toward Alpine. They were trying to get Colton Herta at the time. It didn't work out. And they didn't want to really touch Daniel Ricciardo coming off of his stint at McLaren because they didn't think that he was ready. I know Ricciardo also wanted the break. So they kind of took the chance on de Vries in that one good performance he had at the Italian Grand Prix in 2022. But I guess it just really didn't work out in the end. And like you said, Tyler, fair to Nyck de Vries as well, that this car is one of the worst that AlphaTauri has produced in its history in F1. I mean, this is one of the worst starts that they've had to a season since way back in '07 and '08 when they first really started to enter into Formula One. But just a little bit of the backstory maybe here as to how this happened and everything. I know, Tyler, you brought that up here, but I have this tweet up here from Red Bull Racing News on Twitter, and you guys can go check out their account. And we'll just read off the cliff notes here that this is according to multiple sources. So, again, take it with a grain of salt. It doesn't mean that it's all 100% true. But the decision to sack de Vries was done earlier than expected after the simulation data comparisons between Ricciardo, Tsunoda, and de Vries. De Vries did not hit simulator benchmarks that were set by Yuki. Nyck was given a few more rounds to try and hit these benchmarks on the track, but obviously he wasn't able to do so. The sponsor saw Daniel as a more profitable and more profitable and seen as key to AlphaTauri's rebranding. Of course, they're going to be dropping the name and going to a new name next season. So one of the Red Bull junior drivers, Liam Lawson, he's still part of Red Bull's future. And Helmut Marko does not want Liam Lawson's development interrupted mid-season. He's, of course, in Japan racing in Super Formula, and he didn't really want to put him in that seat, combined with how poor this car is. They thought that that might screw up his potential as well. So Red Bull is also kind of leaning toward the fact that Honda, with its deal with Aston Martin in the next few years, will want to take Yuki Tsunoda with him, which is why they don't really have any big plans for Tsunoda to move into the senior team. And one of the big factors as well here is the Checo Perez side of things here, which is that this seat Daniel Ricciardo is getting now at AlphaTauri might be slightly a warning to Sergio Perez that if he doesn't perform, maybe when his contract runs out, it could be Daniel Ricciardo going back home to where it really all started for him. So what do you think of that, Tyler? Do you think that this is the kind of the underlying decision here from Red Bull to promote Daniel Ricciardo?
The interesting thing is Sergio is under contract for next season as a Red Bull driver in 2024. So what's going to happen there? Does his contract get moved down to AlphaTauri if Daniel Ricciardo all of a sudden comes up and has a phenomenal performance in that car? Who knows? It's going to be really interesting to see how that all plays out. But definitely it could be a warning shot. And just looking at next season's kind of driver market a little bit. There are no confirmed drivers for next year's AlphaTauri car as well. So I guess Yuki's contract must run out at the end of this season with a few drivers. There's about half the grid that isn't locked up for next season.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's definitely a little bit of a warning shot to Checo, but in the end, do we really want to see Danny Ricciardo and Max in the same, team again after the last season together? I mean, like as you're nodding your head as in you want
absolutely.
To see it or you do? Okay.
I absolutely want to see it.
Yeah, like it'd be great, but from what I remember from the last season, it didn't go too well for both Danny and Max. And despite the misses, Checo is still in the points, still in second place. Obviously, could be definitely outperforming to secure that P2 championship position in the end. But he's still being a good teammate to Max in the end. I'm sure he'd appreciate a win, but in the end, that's in his pocket. He's got to pull it out. It's not really up to the team at that point. So definitely a warning shot for sure for Checo, and we'll see what happens. But I think in the end of, I think in 2024, we'll still end up seeing Sergio Perez as a Red Bull driver and in that Red Bull seat, not an AlphaTauri or whatever they decide to change their name to.
Yeah, I mean, he's not having a bad season. The start to his season was phenomenal, Sergio Perez's. Yep. And then since the Monaco Grand Prix, it's kind of really gone downhill. And we were talking about him as a championship contender, and then it all kind of fell apart. And that's been the story of his Red Bull career so far. But I think he's done a really stellar job for the team since he's joined them. And like you mentioned, second place in the championship, still helping in the constructors. But it's not as good as it should be, realistically. If we look at Max Verstappen, he could be leading the constructors championship just on his own with how many points that he scored. But it's interesting because I think that when you start to read about some of the things online, I think Ricciardo, he wanted to take the time off and he was looking to eventually maybe join AlphaTauri in 2024 because he wanted a full preseason under his belt. He wanted a car that next year is also going to be in closer collaboration with Red Bull in terms of the technical side, which would obviously mean a significant increase in performance. And if we're giving the example today, when he was doing the Pirelli tire test in Silverstone, it was testing the Pirelli tires without the tire blankets. And Ricciardo's best time during the test today was a 127.4, which was 7/10 of a second off of Max Verstappen's pole time. Now, keep in mind that these are different, harder compound tires that Ricciardo was driving with without the blanket warmers. Different track conditions. The track was obviously rubbered in after a weekend of the Grand Prix and no rain in the last few days. But you still got to admit, only 7/10 off of Max's pole time is pretty solid, and he had the fastest time today in that test. So this half day of the Pirelli tire test seemed really like the final stamp of approval that the Red Bull bosses needed, and it looks like they pulled the trigger right away to put him into that seat. But let's keep in mind here that Ricciardo now has to perform. I mean, he's taken about a half a year or so off from Formula One. He had a really, really rough last 2 years at McLaren. With the success of Piastri this season, in particular this last race at McLaren, it kind of makes him look even worse than what he did before. So Ricciardo has to come in now. He has to drive a very tricky AT04 that's been probably the worst car this season, certainly the least amount of points scored in 2023. And he's got to go up against Yuki Tsunoda, who has made a lot of improvements in the last 12 months or so. And he's not going to be easy to beat. And a lot of pressure is on Ricciardo. I mean, we might talk about Perez, we might talk about these other drivers at risk, but so is Ricciardo. I mean, his career right now is on the line, because if he were to get beat by Tsunoda the rest of the season, or just be way off the pace like he was in the McLaren days, who would really want to re-sign Daniel Ricciardo after that?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, he does have to perform, and you hope that that Red Bull kind of, I don't want to say car because it's not a Red Bull car, but the similarities are hopefully closer to a Red Bull car where he had that much success rather than the Renault and the McLaren that we saw him where he really struggled. So hopefully it fits his driving style a little bit more. Like you mentioned earlier, he had to completely relearn how to drive after driving that McLaren for a couple of years. So it shows you that how comfortable he was with his driving style with the Red Bull car as well, and how much maybe those two styles, his driving style and the way that Red Bull designs their cars, just mesh perfectly.
Yeah, I'm excited to see. I'm looking forward to see what happens, because I mean he was still a Red Bull reserve driver, so who knows what kind of testing and stuff was involved uh, even beforehand. I know it wasn't doesn't count for AlphaTauri, but still sister teams in the end. So yeah, we'll see what ends up happening with Daniel Ricciardo. I don't know where to put my hopes. They're not very high for Daniel Ricciardo at AlphaTauri. I think he'll do well. Um, but again, like you said, this is definitely the worst car that they put out in a long time. So you can't expect too much from him going into the AlphaTauri. If he can match Yuki Tsunoda's times, I think that's a great start, or even outmatch Yuki Tsunoda. I think that's a great start for Daniel Ricciardo, and hopes of him returning in 2024.
And we won't have to wait long to see how he's going to perform. Of course, he will be in the car for the next race at the Hungarian Grand Prix, which is taking place next weekend. So we will see how it will all unfold. But comment your thoughts down below on the whole situation, Ricardo's promotion, De Vries' demotion, and what you think of the whole situation going forward for next year's driver market. And before we move on to the British Grand Prix, we just wanted to get your quick thoughts there on De Vries, and just an honorable mention to him as well, because very talented driver, like we mentioned before, previous champion in F2 and Formula E as well, and a driver that we thought, and many others thought, should have been in Formula One much earlier than he was, and was, essentially a 26, 27-year-old rookie, which is not usually common nowadays in Formula One. And unfortunate, I really do think he should have at least deserved one season to see what he could have done and to see if he could have improved at the latter stages of the season. But Tyler, you mentioned something interesting just off air as we were talking before we jumped on the podcast, of where you think Nyck de Vries might end up following his demotion from F1.
Yeah, I think IndyCar would be a great spot for him. I mean, there's more and more eyes on IndyCar this season than last season there ever has been, especially from the Formula One side. We're seeing Pato O'Ward get looks, obviously, with McLaren. We're seeing Colton Herta get looks in Formula One. Alex Palou has been he's a Spanish driver. He's been racing phenomenal over these last little bits. He's someone who could get some attention, and we've seen F1, stars and young drivers who, possibly who just, didn't make the cut, head over to IndyCar and have success. Marcus Ericsson won the Indy 500, almost won another one. Currently sitting fourth in the driver standings in IndyCar. Obviously, the big one everyone knows, Roman Grosjean going over. Alex Rossi, of course, he had half his year in Formula One. He's over in IndyCar. He is American, but some names, young names that people might know who have followed F2 over the last few years. There's four kind of big, I'd say four big ones. I mean, obviously you have Christian Lundgaard. He raced in F2 for a while and a very talented driver. You have Callum Ilott, the British driver who received a lot of praise in Formula 2. You have Marcus Armstrong, who was phenomenal at high tech and I thought should have had an F1 sniff. And finally, you have Jack Harvey, who did a little bit of stints in F2 as well. So there's four young drivers who just didn't get the sniff at F1, who have gone over and had decent success in IndyCar and have made a name for themselves in IndyCar. So I think it's a great option for Nyck de Vries. Obviously, he's very comfortable with Formula E, have won a championship there, and that's kind of, you think he would go back to Formula E. However, I think it would be a good challenge for him to head over to North America, get a little bit more marketing for his name out there, especially in North America, and try to make for a name for himself in IndyCar.
Yeah, I agree with you, Tyler. I think IndyCar would be a great switch. I mean, he's already won Formula E. He's already won Formula 2. Is it really worth it to go back as, a 27-year-old in something that's Formula E or something that's considered, the second championship of Formula 1? I think IndyCar would be a great fit. And like you mentioned, like a lot of European drivers from Formula 1 have gone over and have had success in general. So, just to get just to continue racing at the age that he is would be great for him. And who knows with Lewis Hamilton's, I know he's planning on starting a league in the next few years as well. And with that Mercedes partnership, who knows where he ends up.
Yeah, time will tell, but hopefully he can find a seat somewhere. I mean, he's got no short of options, so best of luck to him and whatever he does, but unfortunately his run in Formula 1 is over at the moment. So let's move on then to the 2023 British Grand Prix. We are a few days removed now, but always a good time when we decide to record these podcasts a few days later because news like this tends to break when we do these things. But let's get some of your guys' thoughts on the British Grand Prix, and I guess I'll just start with some generic ones. And the big surprise, obviously, for the weekend was the pecking order behind Max Verstappen and Red Bull. I go into every race this weekend and all the other weekends hoping that somebody will finally upset Max Verstappen and Red Bull. I mean, Verstappen's been on fire this year. He's been driving phenomenally. This Red Bull car is so impressive. But it's boring, guys. I mean, it's just too boring. He's too dominant. It's not challenging. It's not fun to watch, if I have to be really honest with everybody out there. But I was really hoping that, British Grand Prix, there's always some chances for some things to happen. There was rain in the forecast. Okay, Verstappen goes out, dominates again, but I was really surprised to see the two papaya cars of Norris and Piastri not only qualifying really well, but also racing really well. I thought, okay, they qualified on the front row, second row as well. Okay, they're going to fall behind early stages of the race. Hamilton's going to finish on the podium. Maybe the Aston Martins or Ferraris will get in there as well. But they were keeping pace with Verstappen. I mean, Norris was keeping Verstappen quite honest in that first stint, next to overtaking him at the first for a couple of corners in Silverstone. I mean, I have to really think back to this year of who has challenged Verstappen like Lando Norris did this weekend. I thought that was mighty impressive from McLaren, and I hope they can continue on this form because it really adds an interesting dynamic into this best of the rest battle that we got going on here behind Red Bull. But Tyler, what was your thoughts about the British Grand Prix? I know it was more of the usual at the very front of the race, but behind it was quite exciting of how things developed.
Yeah, it really was. And I mean, I think the biggest thing for McLaren, if they would have taken off that chrome, which obviously added a lot of more weight, that's why they didn't chrome out the entire car. I think Lando might have won the race. Uh, but no. In all seriousness, it was great to see some challenges toward Red Bull, and I really wish Piastri got third place. I mean, it was great to see two Brits on the podium at the British Grand Prix. That's awesome for the British fans to see that at their home race. But it would have been really cool for Piastri to get third place. But just a phenomenal showing from McLaren out of nowhere. I mean, we I shouldn't say out of nowhere because we saw sort of hints of it with Lando last week, or last race, I should say, when he was the only one that had the upgrades. But I mean, what a massive upgrade this was! What a success! It is taking this Mercedes, or pardon me, this McLaren team from 16th, 15th on the grid all the way up to the podium in a week and a half. Obviously, it took a lot longer to develop, but to stick that on, what crazy time difference they made. So that's really nice to see, and some surprises as well. I mean, look how the Williams raced really, really well, and not really a track we thought they'd be good at. They're, I know how fast they are in a straight line, but obviously a lot of high speed corners at Silverstone, and they still raced really well as well. So I want to give a quick shout out to Williams. We saw the Ferrari struggle. We saw the Aston Martins, and knew this wasn't going to be one of their strongest tracks as well, and clearly that was shown in the results that they had. But just a really interesting pecking order, and now I'm excited to see what Hungary and Spa are going to bring. I mean, I'd watch out for the Williams at Spa if they can keep up this pace. I mean, they could have get some decent points as well. So yeah, those are my thoughts. It's just an interesting sort of development. And I just want to quickly talk about how you mentioned how boring it is just with Max winning nonstop. And we said the same thing when Lewis was winning, and that's what made the Ricciardo Verstappen thing so frustrating, is because they were fighting with each other when really we wanted them fighting with Lewis. However, Shaker, you mentioned you don't that how excited I am to see Ricciardo and Verstappen back together. I think that's what would make the rest of the season interesting. Is if something like that, or if not next season, make it interesting, is that kind of little rivalry they had and how heated it got during their time. That's what we need this year, is that Nico Rosberg, Lewis Hamilton, scuffle between those two, where there's a rivalry between those two. And even though those two ran away with it, it was still interesting because you had that little bit of a rivalry, and they kept each other honest and pushed each other, and it was dramatic. And this season it isn't. So yeah, I just want to touch on that quickly before I pass it to you, Shaker.
Yeah, no, I have pretty much felt the same way. We kind of felt the same way about Lewis when he was winning for Mercedes. Why can't we have like a Vettel and Hamilton rivalry? Just like a genuine, like honest rivalry where nobody.
Well, that might be the Lando Max rivalry down the line. I mean, they're two good buddies. They raced each other very clean.
Yeah.
Lando left a lot of room, and Max even noted it at the end of the race in his interview. Like, oh, it was great. Max left me lots of room, or sorry, Lando left me lots of room and everything. So, I mean, that could be an interesting, not rivalry, but battle we see down the line.
Yeah. And I want to point out that Lando Norris, I want to comment, I think the same thing last year, Lewis Hamilton, as well as Fernando sent it as well. He's a very clean racing driver all along. And I think it was at Silverstone last year too. Fernando commented how clean Lando is all the way through, and it's really fun racing against him. So I agree. Lando Norris, definitely probably my driver of the day, to be honest, and driver of the weekend. But I can honestly say no one's probably happier than Zach Brown after we saw him in qualifying.
Yeah.
Even Lando, is Zach happy? He's not even on the headset. He is gone.
Tell me you're American without telling me you're American.
I just can't get over the way he pronounces Grand Prix all the time. It really irks me.
Yeah.
And we're from North America. I mean, Canada. We're not American, but it still irks me.
It does, and I don't know if it's just to do with the upgrades they brought, obviously with that, as well as the tires that Pirelli have changed in the last couple of weeks or two, because it seems like a lot of teams are benefiting from the tire change, and except for Red Bull, I think the last 2 weekends are the only team that hasn't really. I mean, personally, I've noted that haven't benefited from it. I might be wrong, but all the other teams seem to be really doing really good with that tire change that they brought in a couple weeks ago too. So,
well, it's interesting. It just reminded me what you're talking about Norris there, and I agree. I think he's one of the more talented up and comers. I think he's better than George Russell in my opinion, and should be hopefully get us a car in the next few years where he can fight with Max and Charles. But one of the interesting things about the whole driver market and developments is that Helmut Marko was saying that Lando Norris is a candidate for the Red Bull seat in the next few years, that they would really like to get Lando Norris into that Red Bull car. And there were talks and some negotiations before Norris had signed a long-term deal with McLaren that they wanted to be at Red Bull. So that's really interesting, because I was all trying to, while we were talking about this whole thing, I was trying to figure out where Ricciardo would fit into this, because Ricciardo was getting into his late 30s and he's not necessarily Red Bull's future. And even if you look at Max Verstappen, I mean, Max could drive another 10 years at Red Bull, but I don't think Max is going to be in the sport for very much longer, if I'm going to be honest with you guys. So I think that it would make sense for Red Bull to look at somebody like a Norris, who would be the future either replacement to Verstappen or just a short-term teammate for Max. But I think Verstappen's so strong at the moment that I don't know if any driver could maybe touch him one-on-one, but it would certainly be interesting to see. And like you said, Tyler, it really is missing. I don't necessarily miss the drama, per se, let's say, that we got between Verstappen and Hamilton a few years ago, but just at least the close rivalry, the close wheel-to-wheel racing and the unknowns that we used to get going into every race weekend of who would win and who would come out on top. But I do have to say that it's really nice to see the respect between Lewis and Max after all these years. This season, anytime they've been on the podium, they've been really almost, they look like friends, and they are now. I mean, just kind of joking with each other, always respect, showing a lot of class. So it's nice to see from the both of them. There's obviously a lot of history there, a lot of tension that you might expect after everything that happened, but they've put it behind them, and they're both cool with each other now. So I like to see that.
So respect between two championship winners there, I guess.
Fan base is not so much, but hopefully they'll catch up.
100%. No, and just touching on Lando's contract, I believe it goes to 2025. The end of the 2025 season. I could be wrong, but I think that's what it was.
Back in 2020 when they signed, it was a long contract.
It's a long one, yeah, something like
Yeah.
that.
5 years or something when they signed him, so that would make sense.
Yeah, so it would be nice to see. I mean, I definitely don't expect that McLaren is going to be the team now to try and put the fight toward Red Bull, but the problem is with this fluctuation of 1 week it's Mercedes the best, the next it's Ferrari, and then 1 week it's Aston Martin, is that nobody's getting closer to Red Bull. And I don't see at the moment any team on pure pace who's going to be able to beat Red Bull. Like Next Track, for example, is going to be another really strong one for Red Bull. Spa is another one as well. So I think unless Verstappen makes a mistake or has some sort of reliability problem, we could be seeing a real potential here for Red Bull to try and sweep all the wins this season. But the British Grand Prix was definitely a really solid race from that perspective from some of these midfield teams. I know Alpine lost quite a bit on that Sunday with the double DNF, so McLaren leapfrogged them right away in the championship. Aston Martin, they just still scored a couple of points. So they're still within touching distance of Mercedes, 22 points behind for P2.
Can you talk about Esteban Ocon at some point? Sorry, I know you mentioned Alpine, but what happened to Esteban Ocon this season?
It's a good question.
No one really has an answer for like the fall off from like, it's not a huge fall off, but compared to what he was performing at last season, it just seems like a huge fall off with Pierre Gasly in the other seat now.
Well, I mean, I will say it wasn't his fault this race. It was a hydraulic leak or something like that. So that's no fault of his own. But I mean, last race, what was it? Was it twice this season he hasn't served penalties properly? He's had
like 5 penalties in 5 different races. There was like 3 races in the row at the beginning of the season where he kept on getting penalties. So I don't know, man. I don't know if it's the track limits or he's just like so racing in his own world.
I mean, Alpine's just kind of a disaster on its own. I feel year after year they just keep disappointing everybody.
Yeah. I mean, Pierre Gasly has definitely been like, keeping them up there somehow, but
yeah. I always expected them to be the ones to eventually fall. I mean, they did score a podium a few races ago in Monaco, but that was kind of maybe very track specific. It was a one-off.
Because that was Ocon too.
Yeah.
But still, overall, I think Alpine's just always been. They find a way to just disappoint. And it's funny on this weekend, too, with Piastri almost scoring the podium, Alonso doing really well this season. It just kind of, you understand now why those decisions were made.
Yeah, no, makes a lot of sense for sure.
Well, what else could we talk about for the British Grand Prix? I know Tyler agreed with you with the special mention on Williams. Even Logan Sargent had a pretty solid race, ended up moving into P11 after that 5-second penalty. So a solid race there, knocking on the doors of his first points in Formula One. So hopefully he gets that soon. But yeah, I'm just trying to think what else happened in the race that we could maybe talk about that was of note.
We had a lot less penalties. I mean, we didn't get a chance to talk about the Austrian Grand Prix track limits.
Yeah.
But I mean, that was just something on its own. But I don't know. I liked it. It kept the drivers honest.
I wasn't that a problem last year too. I feel like they
Yes,
mentioned that they should like make a runoff area or put some gravel down in that same area the last 2 years as well, and it was still a problem this
I,
season. It was
I
more
believe they.
consistent this season or this race, which I kind of liked. You know?
Yeah, you knew what the limits were, and they were
Yeah,
consistent with it.
yeah.
Like I actually had no issues with the track
I
limits.
had
I know a lot
no
of people
issue.
did,
But
but I
yeah,
think you're right. I think they are putting a gravel there next year.
I know they mentioned it the last like they mentioned in Austria last year, and maybe it wasn't Austria, but they mentioned in another race where in all the other areas they have a gravel or sand to stop the drivers from going over, but there it's just like straight concrete, so they just take advantage of it completely.
Mhm.
I think the reoccurring issue with like in particular the Red Bull Ring and some of these others is that they're also used for MotoGP. So for the motorcycles, it's they can't necessarily use the gravel in certain sections of the track. So it's always a kind of a balancing act of Formula One and MotoGP and some of these other series. But I think that why not just do it temporarily? Put the gravel traps in for Formula One, and then when MotoGP comes back, you can just put it back to the asphalt or something like that. Because yeah, the one in Austria was quite a bit of a joke to try and follow the ever changing order 5 hours after the race, after all the penalties
Yeah.
were sorted out. So
I love Lando's comment at the end of that race. Lewis was going on after every lap. Every lap. I was right behind him. I saw him go off every lap.
There's a good Instagram meme video I saw about the penalties in Austria. I can't tell you who did it, but I don't know. It was funny. There's a lot of people making jokes of it.
it is a
Oh,
joke. I mean, just imagine a new fan or just a casual fan trying to understand some of these quirks of Formula One. We've talked about this, I think, for ever since we started the podcast about why not just put things like gravel on the outside of the track, and then we know what the track limits are because the drivers aren't going to go out that far, and it's just as simple as that. So, yeah, I think especially in Austria though, because you have those two final high-speed corners, so it tends to get abused quite as much. Whereas in Silverstone, not so much of a problem. And for next track, for example, in Budapest, not that much of an issue as well. So I think the track limits issue should kind of die down a little bit
yeah.
as the races come on. But yeah, I think that about kind of wraps up the British Grand Prix. Of course, the big chunk of this podcast was really talking about the breaking driver market news. But looking ahead now to the future, two more races to go until the summer break. Next one, of course, at the Hungaroring, which is going to be really nice and interesting to see. And then the final race of July, which will happen at Spa-Francorchamps for the Belgian Grand Prix. So I'll give the final word to you guys here. Anything that's been on your mind since the last time that we saw each other in terms of the F1 world, anything that you're looking forward to or that you wanted to bring up here while we're live on the air?
24 race season calendar got released last week, I believe. Some good notes there. Obviously, Japan moving back into a springtime position, which is interesting. What else? So Las Vegas movie. Oh, that was always in the fall. Qatar in the fall. I don't think it was before. That's now the second last race of the season.
China's back.
Um,
Yeah.
which one's back? Which one's back? Sorry.
China back after like 3 or 4 years since
Oh
2019.
yes,
That's the big one,
that's
right?
that's absolutely right. Yeah, Chinese Grand Prix. Yeah, that's right. So that's good to see as well. It'd be great for Joe to get a home race for him. So good to see that for him. Um, but yeah, it was just interesting. Azerbaijan got moved to 17th. Thank God they got rid of that back to back with Azerbaijan and going to Canada. That was so stupid.
Yeah, no.
So great to see that off the calendar.
So are they? Do they still have two? Do they still have Imola and the Italian Grand Prix still? Or did they
Yes.
take one of them? Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah,
I
Imola, then
knew
Monaco, then
I like
Canada, and then quote me if I'm wrong, 4 Saturday night British time races, um, which is interesting. I like different kind of market they're going for there, so that'll be interesting.
I feel like the British time kind of works for like worldwide in terms of for us too. Like it's like a 9 p.m. 10 sorry, not 9 a.m., 10 a.m. race for us too. So it's not, I mean, yeah, it's definitely more, suited for people in Europe, but it's not terrible for us out here either. I know, I feel like if you're out in LA, you're like looking at like a 6 a.m. start time for that race. So,
Well, at that point, Pacific time, everything starts early. So,
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting that we have those Saturday races next season. I know for the first two ones in Bahrain and Saudi, they're doing it to accommodate Ramadan or the start of
yes.
Ramadan. That they have those first two races in first end of March, end of February, and beginning of March. And I think the Las Vegas one this year as well will be a Saturday race, which was kind of the first time in many years that they've done a Formula One race on Saturday. So a lot of interesting things in the calendar. There's a lot of longer breaks in between some of the races, but then we also have, I think, 3 triple headers and the longest ever season, not just in terms of the races, but also in terms of the duration of the calendar as well. So, yeah, it's going to be quite packed. And
Yeah, speaking on that, Chris, the season starts technically race day is March 2nd, 2024 at the Bahrain Grand Prix, and it will wrap up on the 8th of December. So you're looking at 10 months almost, 9 months.
Wow.
10 months, whatever it is.
Yeah, super long, but we'll see. We'll see if we get the full 24 races because this year we didn't get the full calendar either, and there's always the chance for cancellations or something like that. But we'll see. But yeah, I think that was the big news. The calendar revealed last week, and yeah, I think that was kind of about it in terms of anything else that we might have missed out on in the recent weeks.
Yep, I agree.
All right. Well, sounds good then. I mean, I think that will do it then for this episode of the podcast. A little bit of British Grand Prix review and the latest breaking news about Daniel Ricciardo being promoted to AlphaTauri. You guys got our thoughts on it. So now it's your turn. If you are watching on YouTube, jump down into the comments below and let us know what you think of the latest breaking news and also your thoughts on the British Grand Prix as well. And if you listen to us, whether it's on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere, wherever you get your podcasts, make sure you do subscribe to the BMF1Show podcast so you never miss a new episode from us as well. Of course, we are in the summertime, so we have been taking a little bit of a break here and there because busy with work, busy with vacation. We weren't here some weekends and otherwise as well, so we will try to get as many podcasts out to you guys in the next little while as we can. And of course, we have the summer break coming up in August, which we will be taking a break for ourselves as well and shutting down during that time frame. The good news is I will be at the next race, actually, at the Hungaroring. So I will be providing some footage, some behind-the-scenes stuff as much as I can. And hopefully we'll catch some interesting things for you guys to watch. So look out for that on that channel. And of course, hoping that you guys can join us following the next race as well for a podcast. So I'm looking forward to that. And fingers crossed that we get a new winner in 2023.
I'd love to see that for you in person. If you got to see a wild race in Hungary and a different winner as well, it'd make it an interesting watch for you to be there in person. I hope you enjoy that. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, Hungarian Grand Prix is always exciting, so it should be really good. You're going to see a lot of Dutch fans there too, so.
Yeah,
maybe
absolutely.
you wear that shirt.
I think I will.
You fit in.
I'll bring the full orange kit, but we'll hopefully bring some luck with me, and another team will be able to win. But yeah, always provides a good race, so looking forward to that. And of course, as usual, guys, you check out our social media. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. All of the links can be found in the description, whether it's on the video or in the podcast description as well. So follow us on all these channels. You can keep up with our updates, keep up with the podcast, and any other videos coming out in the channel. Shaker Tyler, any final words before we sign off for today?
Just enjoy the Hungarian Grand Prix. It's gonna be awesome for you.
Yeah, no, same.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely will, and can't wait to share it with you guys. So, for Tyler and Shaker, I've been Chris Cato. Thank you very much, guys, for joining us here on the BMF1Show podcast. We appreciate the support, and we hope you can join us again next time. Until then, it's bye for now. Take care, everybody.